Today I'm here to bring you all one of my favorite videos to film and post, and that is my favorite dark fiction published in 2023. So these are all the new releases for horror, thrillers, and other dark things. And I said before in a previous video, but this has been an amazing year for dark fiction. It's really reignited my love for these genres. I have some honorable mentions floating on the shelves behind me, and I have 10 great books that I have to tell you all about. Hopefully you will check them out and enjoy them as much as I did. All that being said, let's get started. First, at number 10, we have May Fly by C.J. Lead, and this is a book that, in my opinion, really flew under the radar this year. This is a story that follows a woman who lives in LA. During the day, she works as a princess or a Disney princess, working different birthday parties, and then at night, she goes and parties. She's obsessed with different literary figures, particularly Patrick Bateman from American Psycho. And so through a course of different events, she decides to try to live her best life by becoming the persona of him. If you don't know, American Psycho is one of my favorite books, so unsurprisingly, a book that does an homage or a nod to that classic work really grabs my attention. The main character, as you can imagine in a book like this, is very unlikable. They are privileged, and there's just something about the LA party life that is just a mainstay or major part of this book. And I do not like books that are set in Los Angeles. It's just not a city I am particularly drawn to. So the fact that a book like this could grab my attention, even though it was set in LA, really is a testament to the book. And I think it's the fact that it does it so well. For me, this book does for LA the same thing that American Psycho does for the 1980s yuppie culture of Wall Street. It really is a sharp criticism of the glamour, the success, all of the name dropping and brands and so forth. And it's just so well done. So if you need a likable character, you won't find that here. But if you want a sharp, biting story that has a lot of meat to it, is very unsettling with beautiful writing and a unsettling, strange plot, this is one you may want to check out. Then at number 9, we have Death of a Bookseller by Alice Slater. And this is a thriller book that is clearly meant to be a love letter to true crime fans. It follows a woman who gets a job working at a bookstore. She's obsessed with true crime and finds out that one of her co-workers is as well. It turns out that her co-worker has a connection to real life crime, and so because of that, she has this past, this victimhood. And basically it's a book that discusses and analyzes and talks about our world's fascination with true crime, how we become obsessed with it, how it is such a part of pop culture right now. But then this book also dissects it and really looks again at the victims and the complications of liking a genre that is built on people being victimized. And so I think it's a really great book to read for people like myself who really love true crime. I didn't read as much of it this year as I have in the past, but the genre that I want to go back to. So in the book, there are all these references to popular true crime books like I'll Be Gone in the Dark, references to serial killers like Ted Bundy, and it's just all woven throughout the story. Clearly meant for, again, people who love the genre and know it in and out. And again, it creates a really good discussion around that, a really nuanced conversation, and it's overall just a really good story. I had a great time with this one, and I think a lot of people who share my love for true crime will feel the same way. Then at number 8, we have Delicate Condition by Danielle Valentine. And this is a thriller that follows a woman who is going through the process of IVF in an attempt to have a baby. However, everything just seems to be going wrong, and she gets it in her head. She becomes paranoid, thinking that someone is trying to stop her from actually having this process work. It seems like she keeps messing up her medication, missing appointments, and so forth. And she's really afraid that the consequences are going to be really dire for her family. Before I go any further, I will say that there are huge content warnings within this book for anyone who has struggled with fertility, miscarriage, etc. This book does not shy away from those topics, and I really do think that if you're in the wrong space, this book could be very bothersome, because I know for me, while I was going through my IVF, I don't think I could have read this book. But after the fact, it was fascinating to read. I've talked about my channel, I did IVF, and this book definitely hit home for me. Part of the reason that it is on my list is just because, again, I'm talking about my personal favorites for the year, and this one hit me on a personal level that other books didn't. However, I realize that I have people watching this who haven't necessarily gone through IVF or perhaps never will, and if you are not interested in the topic, it's just generally a good thriller. It has good twists and turns. It is more so a thriller, but it plays into horror narratives and tropes in a way that I found really pleasing. I don't want to give away, but as you read through the story, you're definitely going to see the nods to some really influential works, and it went in a direction that I thought it was going to go, and then it took some good twists and turns and went some other ways that made the book feel much more fresh and unexpected. So I had a great time reading it. It's again a very simple classic thriller, but done very well with a topic that is very close to my heart and some really positive and optimistic messaging around IVF, a topic that can be very controversial in different groups. And so I really love what this book is trying to do. It's smart, it's different, it's fun, and it was definitely written for me. Then at number 7 is The Shards by Brent Easton Ellis, and I just talked about how much I love American Psycho, so not surprisingly, I was very eager to check out their newest release. This book is more of a reference to their previous literary work, Lesson Zero, and so I did read that book before going on to this one, which I do recommend doing because you will see the influence there. This one is one of their meta books, very similar to something like Luna Parks, which you might have seen on another list of mine. And so within the story, it is set back in their school days, and it is writing a fictionalized version of themselves in the time leading up to them writing Lesson Zero. So we follow them in their young school days as they are partying, doing drugs, hanging out with friends, exploring their queer identity through different sexual encounters. So this book is very much focused around the coming of age experience written around the author. And again, with this author, I always find it very interesting where you don't exactly know, or at least I don't because I don't always do the research, of what is fact and fiction within the story. Again, it's presented in a way that reads like fact, but it's presented within a fictionalized novel. And so I found those aspects really intriguing. Within the setup of the story, there's the idea that there is some serial killer that is attacking the students, and that is kind of part of the larger story. In my mind, I wish that that had been a larger part of it, because instead those serial killer murders are just kind of happening in the background of the story. And again, it's much more about Brett as an individual as he is growing up. So it's a book that I liked but wasn't entirely satisfying, so it didn't end up higher on my list. But even a not the best Brent Easton Ellis book, it still ends up being a favorite of mine because I really like his writing, his style. There's a lot that I find really intriguing. Again, with meta stories, it's just a style or trope that I really enjoy reading in stories. So this one worked for me. It's not perfect, but it's the kind of book that even though I had missteps as I was reading it and wasn't entirely sure I was enjoying the process, when I finished the book, I could not stop thinking about it. And for me, that's a sign that the book really holds merit. If I can't get it out of my head, that is a book that leaves a long impression on me and ends up on my list. Then at number 6, we have Yellow Face by R.F.Kuang, and this is a more of a lighter thriller on this list than most of the other books I'm talking about. Perhaps a controversial pick. It's a book that is kind of either loved or hated by readers and reviewers. I obviously fall on the side of really enjoying it. This story, if you don't know, follows an inspiring writer who has a friend who also is a writer and is much more successful. Something happens, they die, and they end up stealing their friend's manuscript for this book and publishing it as their own. Now, within the story, there's a lot of conversations about own voices writing, because this main character is attempting to appear to be a certain racial group that they are not a part of. And so there's a lot of conversations about who is allowed to write and who is not. And I really like what R.F.Kuang does, because clearly she is pulling her own criticisms that she has received as an author and turning them all around. And often what you would expect with a book like this is that it's going to get really preachy and really opinionated, and you're going to hear the authorial voice really strongly in the work. Certainly the author has intentions behind this book, but what actually surprised me though is the fact that often the characters and the narrative focus of the story surprised me, because often you have the characters kind of playing the devil's advocate and arguing the opposite side, and I actually had myself questioning and then double questioning and then going back and forth. And I was just pleasantly surprised by the story, because despite appearing to be kind of a cute, buzzy thriller, really the story has a lot of nuance and really dissects the conversation and explores the gray area. Because so often when we have these conversations about who's allowed to write this and what kind of representation we want to see in books, usually it's so black and white, and there really is no space in the middle for that conversation. And so I really love that the author does not try to preach on a doorstep, but instead really try to have that conversation with the reader, challenge your opinions, challenge your preconceived ideas. And I just thought the story was really smart, really entertaining, Definitely, again, a lot lighter and cuter than I normally would, but if you look at the meat of the story, there's a lot of really smart messaging that is going on underneath the surface, and I thought it was really well done. I love this author. Next is The Crane Husband by Kelly Barnhill, and this is a short novella that explores dark fiction through the lens of magical realism. We have this teenager who's just trying to survive with their single mother, taking care of their younger brother. They're really living on the poverty line, and so there's a lot of struggle of just getting food on the table. And then within the story, right at the beginning, the woman, or mother rather, brings home a husband who happens to be a crane. And then through this process, this young woman loses her autonomy within the house and becomes abused and subjugated by this male stork who comes in and controls the households. Obviously, you can tell that this is meant to be a clear representation of domestic abuse. It's a topic that I don't see touched enough in books, or at least not in a thoughtful, nuanced way. And so I really appreciate this book for what it was doing. Obviously not an entertaining read, not an easy read, not a fun read, but a really important one. It's done in a way that obviously you have to know your own triggers. I wouldn't personally recommend this to someone who is being abused themselves, but if you're open to looking into a topic like this, I do think that it's well done. It's never written in a way to sensationalize the abuse. Instead, again, because it is done through the presentation of this bird, they have it that they were pecking at them, and it just kind of separates it from the human act in a way that I think makes it a bit more palatable for someone who, again, might be nervous that this book will be triggering. So you have to know yourself, but I thought this book was beautifully done. The writing was lovely. The story was simple and sweet. And sometimes if you look at my favorites, often I love novellas because there is no fat on them. They are just perfectly slim, telling a really powerful story without any excess. The story or plot never gets lost along the way, and the messaging is really clear. So I love this one, and again, another book that I feel like doesn't get enough attention. Technically, it could have classified as fantasy, but I want to include it on this list because I think it better applies here. Then at number 4, we have Deliver Me by Elle Nash, and this is a really unique, gripping thriller horror book that follows a young woman who works at a meat processing plant. Right at the beginning of the story, she is trying to get pregnant. She has suffered from multiple miscarriages, so obviously trigger warnings there, and she's hoping that this pregnancy will last. You follow her in her home life. She has a boyfriend who she calls Daddy, and she lives with her family, and you find out that she comes from a very strong religious background. They are evangelical Christians, and that very much plays into the story. This is one that is just a very strange, uneven story in the best possible way. The aspects involving the meat processing plant gave me small vibes of Tender as the Flesh, which is a huge recommendation for me. So anything even a bit similar to that grabs my attention. The writing, the style is all very visceral and almost a bit bare in the way that it's done, in a way that really appeals to my reading taste and preferences. The story obviously dives into a lot of social commentary around evangelical Christian culture, the expectations around the role of women, the role of mothers, pregnancy, all of that. It's just very uneven and targeted, and again, the narrative perhaps is a bit fragmented almost, but that's almost what makes the book work so well. Is I found it to be very jarring and unsettling because I wasn't entirely sure where the book was going. It's so odd, it's so unique, and it's just so different than the very commercial thrillers I'm normally reading. This is a book that completely caught me by surprise. I adored it when I read it. I would highly recommend it. It's definitely one I want to read again. It is just so smart, so near perfection, and I really think a lot of you that share my taste in books are going to enjoy this one as well. Then at number 3, we have Becoming the Boogeyman by Richard Chismar. The first book in this series was a favorite of mine, and so unsurprisingly this one is as well. This is a very meta story where the author tells a fictionalized version of their life. In the first book, they are recounting their childhood where they believe there was a serial killer that was targeting women, and then in the aftermath of that book, the question is whether or not someone is copycatting that original serial killer and is out again. And so we follow the author in this story as he has to speak with the individual who has been accused of the original serial killer crimes and trying to figure out who is behind all of this. This is a book that is clearly meant to be reminiscent of the Ted Bundy cases or his crimes, as well as, of course, the Silence of the Lamb, Red Dragon series. And so you do see that influence within it, and the author does not shy away from that. They don't pretend that they're not pulling from it. They will make clear clear references throughout the story, which I think is the right way to go when you're going to make such an on-the-nose comparison in your story to such iconic work. So I really enjoyed this one. I was gripped into the story. I am someone, as I've said before in this video, that really enjoys metafiction. I like questioning how much of what I'm reading is real versus fictionalized. I appreciate the author gives an afterword where he does kind of dive into that, but the mystery I just found so compelling, and the characters are very real and raw. And again, I think it will appeal to those of you that love that true crime serial killer bent, because it's clearly pulling on the tropes and threads that we love so much and we read over and over again, but it's done in a way that never felt tired. I am honestly a little bit tired of serial killer fiction. So to have a book so high up my list that is on the nose dealing with those topics says a lot to how good it is. So I really enjoyed this book. I hope there's more in this series, and I highly recommend checking it out if you haven't yet. Then at number 2 is Chlorine by Jade Song, and this was nearly the number 1 pick, so just know that it's neck and neck. I really love this book. This is a coming-of-age story that follows a female swimmer who is into competitive swimming. She has her friends, her coaches, and also her home life with her parents, or specifically her mother, who is putting a lot of pressure on her to perform. So within the story, we follow them as they're trying to grapple with their sexual identity, trying to deal with their friend group, trying to achieve their goals within the swimming competitions. And then within the story, they're also very much compelled, or have this feeling that they feel like they almost are, or should be, or could be a mermaid. And it's a story that is a weird blend between a coming of age, it has horror elements, it feels fantastical, and reading it, I don't really want to give it away. It's a story that as you follow along, things progress, and I really didn't know how far the story was going to take those mermaid elements. It's weird, it's messed up, it's detailed and thoughtful. It has some great character moments, some really good conversations around being an Asian minority, having Asian parents, the conversations again about being queer and coming out. And of course, I am someone who loves fictionalized stories involving female athletes, and so this story was just written for me. I definitely think that it's not going to be a favorite for everyone, but if you share my unique mix of tastes and preferences, this is a story that I just found sharp and cutting. And again, it got very visceral and unique as the story went on. It's a story that I read early in the year and gripped me, and honestly, I didn't think anything was going to surpass the story all year, and it barely didn't. I easily could have put this book in the number 1 slot and still been satisfied with my list, but I'm going to put in the number 2 slot because I think I have a book I love a touch more, but this one is so fantastic. I really hope that you give it a try if it sounds at all up your alley. And finally, at the number 1 spot, we have Black Rivered Orchard by Chuck Wendig, and this is one of the last minute books that came onto this list. I read it just recently, absolutely loved it, and it had to make a spot, and when I looked at my list, I realized that it really was perhaps my favorite of the entire year when it comes to new release horror and thrillers. So if you don't know, this is a piece of epic horror, which I describe to be a chunky book that is told over multiple perspectives with a large scale to the horror and adventure to it. And so the story primarily starts out by following this daughter and her father. Her father has just discovered or created this new form of apple, and so he's going off to sell it at the farmer's market. His daughter is helping him even though she's allergic and isn't really into apples, and then the story progresses from there. It's one that I honestly feel like is best to go in with without knowing too much, but you follow a town that becomes very fanatical about apples. And within the story, you will learn more than you ever want to know about the different types of apples, the different ways of grafting them, the seeds, the history of them, how they were brought to North America. You will learn so much about the history, more than you ever thought you want to know. But personally, I found it all absolutely fascinating. And the story itself, if I haven't said it before, is absolutely gripping. It's engrossing, and it's also very gross. The imagery, the descriptions, the visuals that you will get in your brain as you're reading the story just are cemented on there for me. There were so many moments that I found myself very disturbed and bothered by what I was reading. And I love that experience. I'm someone who can be very desensitized because I read so much. And so when a story really grabs me and hits me on that emotional and visceral level, I know the story is doing something right. I love this author's work. I definitely want to read more. Highly recommend this one. It is such a good one. I think it has a lot of wide range appeal, and I hope you check it out if you haven't yet. It's so good. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know the books I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And what is your favorite dark fiction book that was published this year? If you have one, drop it in the comments, and I'd love to talk to you more there. If you're new to my channel, I do read a lot of horror, thriller, science fiction, fantasy, And don't forget, I'm going to have more videos coming with my best of the year fantasy. And so I hope you stick around, subscribe. If you want to help me out with this video, you can give me a big thumbs up. You can drop a comment, even if it's just an emoji. Think of something creepy to put in there. And if you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.